But yeah, so I'm Jack, I'm from Urban Scale Interventions. We're a creative design studio based predominantly out in Northern Ireland, in Belfast, but also as well, I'm based here in London. And what we do in a very quick nutshell, because I know that we're short on time, but we design cultural interventions to improve well-being. So we do a lot of work with the Department of Health, on public health, and with local councils to look at how we can design interventions to improve well-being, particularly in public space. And obviously, a lot of the guys have been talking about that today. And I'll just briefly touch on how we do that. I'm sure many people are familiar with this, but we do it through a process called the Double Diamond Design Process, which is a fairly well-established design framework by the UK Design Council about 15 years ago, but effectively divides the design process up into this phase of initial insight gathering and reframing of the problem and the brief, and then a phase of kind of co-design before actually delivering interventions. And so we go through that process on all the projects that we undertake. I'll talk today just briefly in 5 minutes or so about a project that we're doing in Derry, Londonderry in Northern Ireland, particularly around the River Foyle. So it's 6 miles of city-facing riverfront and the 3 bridges along it. And effectively, we were approached through the Public Health Agency and through the Royal College of Art to look at innovative and creative approaches to dealing with suicide prevention and mental health in general along the River Foyle. They have an expression in Derry, Londonderry, which is "I'm ready for the Foyle," which is a sort of a negative perception of the river and the riverfront. And so we started to look at that, and we went through the design process, and we went out and we engaged with a number of groups and individuals and residents to look at what their aspirations and what their priorities for the river. And we started to undertake a series of creative design workshops to map some of those aspirations and priorities. And we also undertook some sort of fairly larger scale public art pop-ups. So this was a public art pop-up that we did that was based around a local folklore that they have there around, or a local tale around a whale that swam up the river during the 70s. But we used it as a research tool effectively to go out to residents at various festivals, and we engaged with about 15,000 residents of the city, asking them what they wanted to see from their riverfront. So through all of this engagement, that led to a model for improving mental health along the river along the River Foyle that sort of incorporated some of the suicide academic research together with design research and behavioural change research as well. I won't go into the detail of it just for time, but safe to say that this engagement led to this model, which informed then 3 social and cultural interventions that I'll talk about a little bit in the next 3 or 4 minutes. So Foyle Bubbles was one of those interventions that we've designed along the River Foyle, and really it's in response to people effectively saying there's nothing really to do along the River Foyle. There's nothing. The city, because of some of the history, has kind of turned its back on the river to some extent. So there's not bars and restaurants and activity along the River Foyle. And there are some areas of it that can feel quite secluded and quite isolated. There's a nature reserve, and there's a lot of backs of warehouses and backs of supermarkets and that kind of thing on the river. So we started to look at, well, how can we bring activity and life back to the riverfront? And that's the Foyle Bubbles. So the Foyle Bubbles is a series of 40 pop-up portable spaces that can be rented out by local entrepreneurs and local community groups for activity along the river, to try and attract activity and festivity to the riverfront. But there's also a mental health angle to this. So the occupiers of these pods, the entrepreneurs or the groups, have to undergo mental health awareness training to occupy these spaces. So they can occupy them for free or for peppercorn rent, as long as they undergo this mental health awareness training. And it starts to bring a sort of community response to mental health and vulnerable people at the riverfront. Importantly as well, we can use them as beacons. So during the evening or at night, we can start to light up isolated spaces along the riverfront. And another thing that we were looking at, and it goes back to a little bit, I suppose, of the discussion that we were having in the first hour of this session, is along the lines of how can we incorporate some digital technology as well within this. So we started to look at, if we have these pods along the riverfront, can they start to act as digital assistants, almost sort of smart city digital assistants? So although we might not be experiencing too many tourists in the near future, you can start to see how they might respond to people as they pass by. You know, where can I get a pint of Guinness? It might be able to respond this pod and say, well, you know, just down there, there's an interesting bar that you could do that. But importantly, we could use that as well to start to look at the well-being and mental health angle of that. So, for example, at 3 o'clock in the morning, when it's very isolated and secluded, could it start to spot signs of vulnerable people along the riverfront and just act as a little bit of a beacon, just to say, hey, you know, are you okay? Or, you know, it might light up, it might play some sounds, just to show that actually, you know, there's people around or there's people there. So it's not replacing human contact, but it could start to respond to people along that riverfront. Fall experience, I'll talk about very briefly, but a similar thing really, we were looking at how can we bring festivity and activity to spaces that might be typically secluded or isolated. So last year we put a series of pop-ups along the Peace Bridge in Derry, Londonderry. So quickly designed, but they were sensory pop-ups. So they had soundscapes, they played local sounds when you pass by, they were tactile, and we put them on the bridge there to see how they influence people's behaviour as they cross the bridge, and could they potentially distract people while they were walking across the bridge. So we had 15,000 people cross the bridge over the weekend, over the bank holiday weekend last year, and 82% of those people interacted with these pop-ups in some form or another. The reason for this, one of the bridges across the River Foyle is the Craigavon Bridge, and we can't actually touch this bridge in any sense because it's a listed bridge. But could we start to play around with soundscapes or lightscapes to then start to influence people's behaviour along that bridge and potentially distract certain behaviours, or certain look at how respond to certain behaviours, and obviously particularly the case when it is more secluded and in the middle of the night. And the final intervention I'll just talk briefly about is the Foyle Reeds. So this is the Foyle Bridge. It crosses the River Foyle and it spans 850 metres. It's 9 stories tall at its highest point. And this is the experience of crossing it. It's very windy, and this the railing here is just over 1 metre tall. So it's not a very pleasant place to cross. Whilst in a traditional sense, what we might look at architecturally is to put up some form of a barrier, so sort of a 7-foot or 10-foot tall fence. We don't feel that does anything to really change the mindset of the place as one of negativity or a negative space. So we started to look at local assets and what are the things that people are really proud of from their local area. One of which being the local nature on the riverbank. And we designed the Foyle Reeds, which is the largest proposed art installation in Northern Ireland, that also just happens to act as a prevention barrier. So again, we use technology as well here. The lights interact and respond to passers-by as they pass along the bridge, and so they might change in intensity or change in colour. And you can also download an app and change the light to a colour of your choosing to try and change the mindset of that bridge. And again, here you might see it lit up for citywide events, for example. So the idea behind this was, can we use technology on the bridge to change the mindset of that space as one that was of negativity and isolation and loneliness, to actually one that's more about celebration, and it responds to people and activity.
Thank you for to wrap up. Thanks.
Yes, that's it. That's me. So I was saying, final thing. Obviously, those interventions there, we're now starting to deliver at a departmental level across Northern Ireland.